That night, for the first time in months, James dreamed of Petra. He heard her voice through a fog of what felt like great time and distance. He couldn't make out her words, but the tenor and lilt of her voice was unmistakable. It awoke in him the unguarded truth, irresistible and implacable in the uncomplicated core of his sleeping heart. He loved Petra. He had loved her for years, despite rarely seeing her, despite the complexities of her mysterious past and her uncertain future, despite even the doubt that sometimes haunted his waking mind. He loved her with the sort of hopeless, unabashed devotion that surpassed reason and intellect and shot straight to the bright solar center of his heart, charging and dominating it like a permanent lightning bolt. Petra owned and occupied his deepest love. He could pretend otherwise while awake, but here, in the depths of the dream, the truth was an iron weight, heavier than the world. He approached her through the fog, tuning her in, following the silver and crimson cord that bound them, and her voice began to clear. There was another voice as well, a man's voice. Was it the Muggle private detective she had partnered with back during the intrigue of the Morrigan Web? James thought not. Marshal Paris was an American. This voice was British, and a bit younger. James recognized it, but only vaguely. Gradually their voices became clearer, closer, although still hidden behind great heaving masses of fog. James propelled himself onward, pushing through the cold grayness. "I won't dissuade you," the man's voice said, still thin with distance. "In fact, you'll recall that it was my idea almost 2 years ago when you found me again." "I do recall," Petra said, "but I dismissed the idea as your usual foolhardy blathering. You've always tended to be a bit emotional and thoughtless when it comes to protecting me." The man seemed unperturbed by this. "So, what's changed?" "What you suggested thoughtlessly, I've given serious consideration." James pressed on, and finally the fog broke into tatters. Silver-frosted clouds stretched around him like arms, blocking the moon, casting shadows over a dark landscape. A small town with only a scattering of glowing windows, a scarcity of lit street lamps. And then, past this, a huge building on a hill encroached on all sides by forest and bramble, almost claimed by creeping vines and tangled roots. It was a mansion, though very old and utterly dark, except for a single upper window which flickered with the faintest suggestion of light. James approached it, slowing, listening, wanting nothing more than to hear Petra's voice again, to see her, even if it was all merely a figment of his sleeping mind. "You have what you need," the man's voice said. "What do you require me for?" "No one grasps the underlying magic and spellwork like you do," Petra said. "It's your particular genius to understand the magic behind the wand." The man's voice, even more familiar now, seemed to smile doubtfully. "Petra, your visit to the Armory of Forbidden Books provided you everything you need to know regarding the underlying magic and spellwork." "Then maybe I just need a friend," Petra sighed. "Someone who's known me long enough to tell the truth. Someone impartial enough to see my real intentions. You know why I'm doing this, don't you?" James slowed as he neared the window. His dreaming mind rippled through the old glass without a sound. He entered a dark room with nothing but a small fire illuminating it, guttering and spitting in the hearth. The rug, as James's bare feet touched it, was greasy and threadbare with age. The walls were filthy, cracked, leaning. James brushed them, and his fingers came away thick with damp grime. The only furniture in the room was a pair of high-backed chairs facing the fire. Beneath them, sitting close to the light of the flames, collecting their glow and glinting brightly, was a silver tray. Something sat on the tray. Not a cup or saucer, a butter knife. James drew closer, not sure he wanted to see. Mostly he just wanted to approach Petra, to look upon her face, to see the glimmer of her eyes and the dark luster of her hair. He missed her. His heart burned for her. You're doing it because the world needs you, the man said soberly. But the world doesn't know it. The world wants to stop you by whatever means necessary, even if it means killing you. They blame you for everything. Petra sighed deeply. They may not be entirely wrong in doing so. That's beside the point, the man went on. Even if you are the problem, you are also the solution. They cannot be allowed to stop you. For the good of all, both the Muggle and magical worlds, you must survive. Your life is more than yours. It belongs to the world, to the universe. No matter what, you must survive. James occupied the deep shadows of the room, creeping closer. He could see the top of Petra's head over the back of her chair now. The firelight flickered on it like burnished bronze. I must survive, she repeated the words with mingled regret and resolve. So even though we are here, in the house of the one whose bloodline I'm cursed with, even though I am willingly calling on his power now instead of thwarting it, as I've struggled to do at every step so far, he did this for his own selfish aims, for power and destruction. You do it for the good of the world. In the darkness, James blinked, as if coming fully awake in his own dream. What was happening here? Swiftly, he replayed the conversation he had been barely hearing, having been too enthralled by the sound of Petra's very voice to attend to her words. He glanced around at the room he was in. The smell of mold and rot filled his nose. What was this place? What had she just called it? The house of the one whose bloodline she is cursed with? James suddenly understood, knew with the unshakable certainty of the dream. This was the mansion of Tom Riddle's father, long abandoned, overgrown and falling to rot. He looked down towards the silver tray that glimmered in the firelight. Upon it was a dagger, its handle encrusted with jewels, its blade dark and sooty, tarnished almost black. He recognized it immediately. It was the dagger that had killed Morgan, the Petra from another dimension, wielded in the hand of Judith as part of her chaotic plan. How had Petra got it? More importantly, why? Fear and horrible suspicion suddenly welled in James, and yet he crept forward still. It's just a dream, he told himself. I'm only dreaming. None of this is real. Petra finally came into sight as she leaned forward, reaching for the dagger, collecting it into her thin hands. She cradled it in the firelight, her eyes wide, bright as she looked down at it. She drew a deep breath and shuddered as she let it out. Without raising her gaze from the dagger, she began to speak to it. As she did, James's eyes widened in horror. The fire responded to her words, first growing restless in the hearth and then flaring with bursts of hungry green, almost seeming to breathe. As Petra reached the end of her recitation, wind entered the room, coming from nowhere and everywhere, lifting the limp curtains, carrying dust and grit into the dank air, moaning throughout the dim, empty rooms of the decrepit mansion. James could scarcely believe the words that came from his beloved's lips, spoken with slow, undeniable emphasis. Extinguished soul's essence risen, final breath from murdered host. Enter now this your prison, slave to my fragmented ghost. Petra held the dagger higher, her voice rising even as the rushing air combined with the flames of the hearth, carrying them around the room and illuminating it with green fire. She ignored this, her voice becoming a low boom through the growling tempest. If I should die before I take the course of my intent design, then from this prison re-awake, immortal now, my dread bloodline. Petra's voice became thunder, not shouting, but amplified over the sudden cyclone of wind and fire that burst through the room, lighting it, tearing at the ancient wallpaper, whipping the curtains, condensing into a whirling maelstrom around the slight girl, now standing with the upraised dagger in her hands. Petra! James called out, breaking his paralysis and finally finding his voice. She couldn't hear him, of course. This was just a dream, despite how terribly, frighteningly real it felt. And yet, from the midst of that swirling, horrible cloud, even as it caught her hair, whipped it about her face, and flashed in her stern, glowing eyes, Petra glanced aside at James. She saw him, blinked in a sort of waking flutter, and her face changed. Fear and shame and heartbreak suddenly filled her features, clouded her eyes. The man in the other chair stood then, blocking James's view. He turned towards James, his own face full of surprise and wariness, and more than a little fear. It was, bafflingly, Donofrio Odin Van. He recognized James, opened his mouth to call out to him, but no sound could be heard over the roaring vortex of Petra's spell. The whirl of fire and green light sucked all light into itself and contracted, taking both Petra and Odin Van and even the sprawling dead mansion with it. Everything condensed into one brilliant, terrible point, and the point was shaped like a dagger, as blinding and merciless as the deaths it had caused. And then, with a shock that was both icy and deafening, the point exploded. James shocked awake at the sensation of it, as if thrown the many miles and leagues back into his bed by pure force, nearly crashing through it to the floor at the strength of it. He flung himself up instead and gasped as if he hadn't drawn a breath in minutes. His eyes blinked blearily around the dim silence of Gryffindor Tower. His fellow Gryffindors were still asleep, sprawled variously across their beds, completely immune to the horrendous vision that James had just returned from. But was it a vision? Had it truly only been a dream? Helplessly, he remembered the look on Petra's face as she had seen him, recognized him in the midst of the spell she had conjured. He looked down at his hands in the darkness. Something was smudged on the tips of his fingers, dark and greasy by the moonlight. He touched his hands together and felt the filth of the mansion's walls on them. The smell was still in his nightclothes, the reek of ancient rot and mold and death. Somehow, he had not only dreamed of Petra, he had gone to her. He had physically stood in the same room with her, touched its grimy walls, taken its air with him upon his return. What he'd seen had not been a dream or a vision at all. Somehow, James had seen Petra and the inexplicable figure of Professor Odin Van perform some terrible spell, make some momentous decision that James sensed was irreversible, terrible, and portentous. He tried not to know what that spell had been, but his deepest heart told him what his brain resisted. Petra had gone to the abandoned mansion that had once been the home of her cursed soul's twin, Tom Riddle, the Dark Lord Voldemort. She was no longer resisting his poison influence, but channeling it, using it, bending it to her own will. And with it, she had repeated that villain's most awful, damning spell. James flopped back onto his bed again, still breathing hard, his eyes wide and unseeing in the darkness. He could barely believe it. It was too awful to consider, and yet there was no question in his mind, even now, fully awake and in the comfort of his own bed in Gryffindor Tower. Petra, the young woman that he loved, the girl who had once doodled happy fairies in the corners of her textbooks and sucked on the tips of her black hair during examinations, had done the unthinkable. Amazingly, dismayingly, she had fulfilled the black promise begun by the death of her stepmother years earlier, a death that Petra herself had caused in a fit of blind, righteous rage. Petra had created a Horcrux.